In this presentation, I will be focusing on artisanal and small-scale mining in the Philippines. Many developing nations that possess valuable natural resources, like gold, often depend on large mining corporations for the majority of their revenue. In turn, governments profit due to shareholding and taxation, while the people whom they're supposed to serve receive little to no benefits, only the negative impacts on their health and the environment. This lack of trust and consensus that the government is not operating in its citizens' best interest, in combination with several other factors, often leads to a large informal sector of the economy. Informal economic activity is that which is not recognized and therefore not regulated by the government. In gold-rich regions, this elicits artisanal and small-scale mining, which is abbreviated as ASM. This form of mining is accessible to the everyday person, not requiring advanced technology or expensive tools, and is typically thought of as used as a form of subsistence or as supplementary income, which we will find out later is not always the case. Here we have two different techniques that are used for ASM in the Philippines. On the right, we have tunneling operations, and on the left, we have river panning. You can see that they're using very basic tools and techniques that require very few skills. According to Abby Buxton, a senior researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development, 20 to 30 million people depend on ASM for income worldwide. This is increasingly true in areas where agriculture is no longer available for either property or environmental reasons. And over 40 different countries around the world have prominent ASM sectors that provide jobs as well as mineral output for consumption. So you can see on this graph here, the Philippines is kind of at the bottom. 300,000 people are currently ASM workers, and almost 2 million people depend on it for their livelihoods. And this is true in a lot of countries. So in some of these regions, due to the fluctuation of large-scale mining, global economic demands, and regional job opportunities, ASM growth has surpassed that of mere subsistence living, allowing for accumulation of profit and growth. And this development is most prominently seen in the Philippines, in which ASM has grown to develop a complex, multi-tiered system of labor, one which I will explain later in the presentation. But this growth has allowed many people to have better lives and incomes than was previously ever possible. However, the majority of the ASM workforce still faces challenges of subsistence and poor quality working conditions and overall living. The majority of informal, marginalized workers are still just subsisting with no protection of workers' rights or regulation of their work environment. Now, due to this rising industry, governments have been attempting to formalize it, both for profit via taxation and for the regulation of activities for protection of people and the environment. However, unfortunately, the reasons why countries have abundant informality are also the reasons why it is difficult to impose regulations in the first place. And I'm talking about the government's lack of regulatory capacity. Now, this makes it really tricky to formalize ASM in these regions. Therefore, some questions remain. Is ASM ultimately beneficial for the people of these countries, or does it cause more harm than good? Could the answer to this question change according to whether or not ASM is formalized, or would it make no difference? Is it even possible to formalize ASM? And ultimately, what is the best course of action to be taken for the Philippines that would continue to foster growth while also warding against the exploitation of people? Through my research, I have found that formalization of ASM in the Philippines and countries like it is not particularly beneficial for the lowest levels of the labor force in terms of security benefits and working conditions. And furthermore, the successful implementation of formal ASM is not feasible in the first place, particularly in the Philippines due to their government's low prioritization of it in terms of their research dedication. Now, I want to go back a little bit and explain in more detail the concepts behind the claims that I just made. Let's start by talking about informality, or rather, the informal sector of the economy. Concluded in an economic memorandum by Ana Maria Oviedo, a senior economist at the World Bank, the primary causes for informality in an economy are low institutional quality. This means things like corruption, weak rule of law, excess regulation, which leads to high barriers of entry. And all of these things lead to low trust in institutions, high economic inequality, and low quality of public resources. Now, among these factors, excess regulations are the most significant when talking about ASM, because this is what stops miners from getting permits and licenses, which keep ASM informal. We can see a very strong negative correlation here in this graph between the overall regulation indicator and the GDP per capita. So on the x-axis, we have overall regulation indicator, which is made up of several different regulation factors, such as firm entry, labor markets, trade barriers, and contract enforcements. There's a few more, but those are some of the main ones. And all of these factors have been normalized to fit this numerical scale that you can see on the bottom. And the higher the values on this x-axis represents a heavier regulatory burden. And on the y-axis, we have GDP per capita. So at the top, we can see USA has a very low overall regulation indicator and a very high GDP per capita. And as we move down, you can see less developed countries follow suit. This strong correlation, as shown by the negative 0.81 indicator at the top corner, shows that less excess regulation causes informality, because the larger the informal sector of the economy is, the lower GDP per capita will be, because informal activity is not calculated in GDP because it's not recognized by the government. So, when we see that burdensome regulations correlate with lower GDP, what we're actually seeing is that the burdensome regulations cause more informality, resulting in a lower calculation of GDP. Now that we've gone over some theories for why informality in ASM exists, let's look at some theories for why attempts at alleviating informality have been unsuccessful. So the formalization of ASM simply means the regulation of it through codes, permits, laws, and other such enforcements. But wait a second, didn't I just say that excessive regulations were one of the main contributing factors to informality? Yes, but whether or not the implementation of regulations will increase or decrease informality depends on the type of regulation and the type of enforcement. Regulations only cause informality when they are burdensome and elicit a high barrier of entry. What I mean to say is that the extent of informality depends on several different variables, or at least according to Ciaran O'Farrell, a researcher in the field and distinguished professor. He developed this heuristic, as you see here, which describes ASM in the different regions of the Philippines. So, as you can see, there's a distinction between national and local regulation, which just refers to whether or not the national government recognizes ASM as an issue, as well as a separation between coercive and incentive types of enforcement. And we can see very clearly here that the Philippines has zero national involvement in terms of regulation and enforcements, because the government agencies responsible for ASM are under-resourced, which shows that ASM is not a priority for the government of the Philippines. We can also see that there is a divide in stance towards ASM in the different regions of the Philippines in the local government levels, with Compostela Valley located on the right side of the x-axis due to the involvement of local law enforcement known as the barangay, and armed groups in regulating the activity, as they profit from ASM as well. This puts them in the third quarter of the x-axis, as you can see here, fully on the coercive side of local government. And then we have the Gyang area is near the middle, but still on the right side because they are the ASM regulations are enforced by tribal landowners. Now, this is not necessarily violent, but it's still technically coercive, which is why they're so close to the middle of the x-axis. On the left of the x-axis, we see South Cotabato, and that's because this area has the only Minahang Bayan, which is the term for a designated ASM area, which is enforced and regulated by provincial government officials. And this Minahang Bayan offers incentives such as training and land allocation initiatives, and that's why it's on the incentive side. So, what this tells us is that in the Philippines, there is little to no government involvement, and there is also little to no formal ASM. This is because in order for any type of legitimate formalization to occur, its implementation must be a priority of the government. And this is exhibited by the only somewhat successful example of ASM formalization that I could find, which is the case of Guyana. Here's a picture of an artisanal gold mining site in Guyana, which has unfortunately caused severe environmental damage. Guyana is a success story, but only on paper, and here's why. Over the past 20 years, Guyana's national government has devoted many of their resources to formalizing ASM. And according to Gavin Hilson, an ASM researcher at the University of Surrey, the government was able to formalize 91% of Guyana's gold production by creating feasible barriers of entry and by backing licenses and permits that grant the workers undeniable land tenure, which are property rights. However, while the numbers that they boast seem very impressive, upon further research, I have found that their regulatory practices may not be as solid as they say and end up having similar effects on worker protection and safety as in areas of informal ASM. Jeanette Bolkin, a researcher specializing in the communities and livelihoods of South America, claims that while the government of Guyana has technically been successful in their formalization of ASM due to the rampant corruption in the area as well as insufficient policy formalization, the casual labor force still does not receive the benefits. In her research, she explains that basically what ended up happening is instead of ASM being carried out by individual laborers or small groups, multiple concessions were granted by the government to single private interest groups, who in turn hire daily laborers to do the work. And because of the policies put in place, the mining license holder is not legally responsible for the compliance of regulations put in place for the benefit of the workers. This has been referred to as landlordism by Bolkin and remains to be a prevalent issue in Guyana today. You can see here, this is a front page taken from Khartoum News, a privately owned daily newspaper published in Guyana. And you can see here that landlordism is a public issue that is also prevalent in Guyanese society. Of all of the countries that depend on ASM, Guyana is the best example of formalization. And even when formalization was successful in the eyes of the government, it was not successful in protecting workers' rights. So, unlike the government of Guyana, the Philippine government is still in support of large-scale mining because this is a secure source of revenue for them. And therefore, their regulations, they don't favor ASM. They favor the formal sector of mining, which is large-scale mining. And if the Philippines were to successfully formalize, they would have to switch completely from supporting large-scale mining to full-heartedly supporting ASM. And furthermore, effective policies and legislation would need to be put in place with sufficient resources to implement them, in addition to safeguards against corruption of local government. Because, it says something that Guyana is our best example of success, and it's nowhere near successful in achieving what we all think of as the picture of success. All right, so we have part 2. So I'm just going to go over the details of ASM in the Philippines, as well as some pros and cons. So there is primarily one researcher who is responsible for current information on informal ASM in the Philippines, and that's Boris Verbrugge. Verbrugge, or Verbrugge, but I think it's Verbrugge, has spent several years within the Philippines researching and remains to be one of the most cited authors on the topic. Thus, unless otherwise stated, the information that I present about the Philippines can be attributed to him. The growth of ASM in the Philippines started in the fall of the mining corporations. So there was a big mining boom starting in the 1970s and ending in the 1980s. Because of a serious political and economic crisis in the area having to do with the end of the Ferdinand Marcos dictatorship, which I won't go into here because that's a whole other topic. But anyway, the fall of large mining companies in the 1980s left behind a huge number of semi-skilled laborers. And while this was happening, there was also a scarcity of land for agriculture and a failure of subsistence farming that led to a partnership between landowners and skilled workers in starting their own mining businesses through shares or individual cuts of the profit. As you can see, after the 1980s, ASM production consistently increases, while large-scale mining, abbreviated LSM, consistently decreases. So this is small scale, going from 136 to over 17,000. And here's large-scale mining, going from 25,000 all the way down to 14,000. And at its lowest was 12,000. Once these smaller operations started turning a profit, other parties started to take interest, and thus these smaller operations began being financed by a number of outside investors looking for profit, such as Sino-Filipino merchants, local politicians, and barangay officials who reside in the lowest level of local government. These outside actors are also known as rent seekers, and you can see them represented at the very top of this labor force diagram under rent seekers. As the industry began to gain even more traction, these rent seekers needed specialists such as engineers, chemists, and explosive experts to aid in these now medium-scale operations. And you can see these also represented here. This resulted in the diversification and specialization of jobs as businesses grew to encompass all aspects of the gold mining, from tunneling to gold processing. This has created more and better quality jobs for many, especially those who lost their main source of income when the large mining companies moved out. This result has been what Verbrugge describes as a new class of nascent mining elite. This group of mining elite consists of merchant investors as well as a corpo tier of the labor force who have had the opportunity to invest in mines after the fall of large-scale mining in the area. These are the diggers who are in the corpo section of the labor force diagram. And these are the people who were the semi-skilled workers that are experiencing most of the benefits of this rise in ASM. Right, so this nascent mining elite has experienced upward social mobility, which has never really been seen before in other countries that depend on ASM, and has occurred for several unique reasons. As we previously discussed, ASM in the Philippines is largely self-regulated within communities by dominating political figures, barangay officials, and the like. Thus, social networking has become a tool to further opportunities for economic development. Many outside financiers use local intermediaries, who are usually trusted corpo members, to recruit workers, and if you have an in with them, you have a job. Furthermore, these new mining elites, because of their new wealth and status, have been able to participate in political elections, which would further influence the future of the region. With that being said, we will talk about this later. The corruption index in this country, political elections aren't necessarily a sign that the people will have a say, but it's still something that we've never seen before. However, looking at this labor force diagram, you should notice that there's a distinction between the rent seekers and miners and that of the casual labor force. This bottom row has not been targeted for formalization initiatives. And while this doesn't affect much in itself, because formalization techniques are largely ineffective, it symbolizes a class of people that are especially neglected in their rights as workers for fair compensation and working conditions. A large health risk to these workers is cyanide, a harmful chemical compound used to process the gold that has been extracted. According to Anna Marie Luong, a medical doctor and community health practitioner in the Cordillera Administrative Region in the Philippines, processing plant workers process the ore with cyanide using their bare hands. This is extremely dangerous and can result in severe cognitive impairment as well as chronic cyanide exposure, which ultimately leads to death. In addition to these harmful conditions, due to the lack of regulation of ASM, these workers receive no Social Security, no economic security, and no power to do anything about it. So, while a small percentage of miners in the Philippines experience great benefits, the vastly growing population of casual laborers experience none other than the ability to work. And with the expanding industry, this sector of the workforce will continue to be marginalized and subjected to extremely harsh working conditions, some of which will most likely shorten lifespans. Just because someone is willing to work in these kinds of conditions, it does not mean that it is acceptable to let it happen. So, thinking about those questions at the beginning of the presentation and my original answers to them, I hope that you can now see the justification behind my claims. We now know that formalization of ASM would not benefit the lower tiers of the workforce, but would benefit the government through taxation of activities and fees. As shown in the case of Guyana, even though the majority of the ASM was formalized due to the weakness of the state, those in more powerful positions were able to bypass regulations, and the majority of workforce experiences remained the same, the only difference being the revenue gained by the government. And because the government of the Philippines is not economically stable and is declining in its corruption perceptions index, as we can see here in this diagram, this just means Philippines, it dropped lower in 2017 to 111th out of 180 countries. This is a very small decline, but it still shows that there's no reason to believe that they're improving in their corruption, and they're already corrupt to a point where you can't trust that the things that they say they will implement will actually implement in reality, like in the case of Guyana. So there's no reason to believe that they will not succumb to the same problems found in Guyana. And as seen in the heuristic earlier, the government of the Philippines is not even interested in formalizing ASM. So, looking at the future of ASM in the Philippines, while there are those who are living much better lives than before, making enough money to support themselves and have some left over, there is a growing number of people who work long days with low pay, poor working conditions with serious health effects, and job insecurity. Again, in order to solve this, the government must recognize ASM and this issue as a priority. However, there is one other way of looking at it. I am not a proponent of this idea, but I think it plays a part in this discussion. When considering history, is the systematic exploitation of people necessary for economic development? Is someone always bound to shoulder the burden so that the community or society can eventually prosper? This might just be the process that the Philippines has to go through in order to reach the point where corruption is not an issue anymore, and where the government no longer has to depend on foreign mining corporations. Now, I don't know if this is the case, but I encourage you to think about it. As for now, we will just have to wait and see.